Snow drifted through the gray Chicago sky like ashes from a dying fire. The wind howled between towering buildings downtown, rattling traffic signs and pushing icy air through the crowded streets surrounding the courthouse. Reporters huddled near the entrance beneath thick coats, clutching microphones with numb hands while camera crews adjusted their lenses toward the heavy courthouse doors. A police cruiser stopped at the curb. 17-year-old Eli Carter stepped out slowly, wrists uncuffed but still marked red from the ride downtown. His hoodie looked too thin for the brutal January cold, and his worn sneakers scraped against patches of dirty snow as two officers escorted him toward the entrance. People immediately recognized him. "That's the kid. That's the one from TV. I heard the store owner almost died." The whispers followed him like shadows. Eli kept his eyes on the ground. He had learned quickly that looking people in the eye only made things worse. The moment strangers saw his face, they stopped seeing a scared teenager. They saw headlines. They saw trouble. They saw every stereotype the city had already decided to believe. Inside the courthouse lobby, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while security officers barked instructions at visitors moving through metal detectors. Eli's stomach twisted painfully as he stepped forward. The machine beeped loudly when he walked through, causing nearby reporters to glance over immediately. One photographer snapped a picture. The flash hit Eli like a punch. For a second, he remembered another flash, the bright police lights from 3 weeks earlier, reflecting off shattered glass outside Patel's market while someone screamed in the distance. Ever since that night, his entire life had collapsed. Faster than he could understand. He swallowed hard and kept moving. Courtroom 18B sat near the end of a narrow hallway crowded with reporters and curious strangers hoping to witness another disaster unfold. Some held coffee cups. Others scrolled through social media posts discussing Eli as if he were already guilty. Violent teen suspect. Gang-related robbery. Repeat troublemaker. None of them knew him. But somehow all of them had already decided who he was. Inside the courtroom, the air felt painfully still. Wooden benches creaked softly as people settled into their seats. Eli noticed the prosecutor immediately, a sharp-looking woman confidently organizing thick stacks of files at her table. She looked prepared, certain, like she had already rehearsed the speech that would bury him. Beside Eli sat his public defender, Martin Geller, a tired man with wrinkled sleeves and dark circles under his eyes. He barely glanced at Eli while flipping through paperwork. "You answer only what you're asked," Martin muttered quietly. "Don't interrupt anybody. Don't lose your temper." Eli nodded faintly. The truth was, Martin barely knew him. Their conversations had lasted less than 20 minutes total since the arrest. There were too many cases. Too many kids like Eli moving through the system every day. Disposable kids. Eli looked toward the courtroom doors one last time. Part of him still hoped someone would walk in. Maybe Denise, his foster mother, despite their arguments. Maybe one of his friends from school. Maybe anybody willing to stand beside him for even a few minutes. But the doors stayed closed. That hurt more than the handcuffs ever did. He leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling lights while dread settled deeper into his chest. 17 years old, and already his future felt finished. If convicted, juvenile detention would only be the beginning. Colleges would never look at him. Employers would avoid him. Every mistake afterward would carry this moment attached to it forever. One bad night could stain an entire life. The courtroom buzzed softly as more people entered. Reporters filled the back rows, whispering predictions to each other. One woman adjusted her camera while staring directly at Eli, almost disappointed he looked more frightened than dangerous. Then the doors opened again. A tall man wearing a dark jacket and black baseball cap stepped quietly inside. Nobody paid much attention at first. The man moved calmly, almost carefully, keeping his head low as he walked toward the last row. Snowflakes melted across his shoulders beneath the courtroom lights. He sat alone in the corner without speaking to anyone. But after a few seconds, murmurs slowly spread through the room. A reporter blinked twice. Another lowered his phone in confusion. Wait, is that... Eli barely looked up at first. His hands trembled too badly to focus on anything except the fear clawing inside his chest. But eventually, curiosity pulled his eyes toward the back row. And there he was. Keanu Reeves sat silently with his hands folded, watching the courtroom with an expression Eli couldn't understand. Not pity, not judgment. Something else. Something calm. For a brief second, Eli actually thought he was imagining things. Why would someone like Keanu Reeves be sitting in a criminal courtroom in Chicago on a freezing Tuesday morning? It made no sense. Yet Keanu remained there quietly, observing every detail while reporters exchanged stunned looks around the room. Even the prosecutor seemed distracted now. Eli quickly lowered his eyes again, embarrassed by the sudden attention filling the courtroom. Shame burned through him hotter than the freezing wind outside. He assumed this was some publicity event or documentary appearance. Famous people visited rough neighborhoods sometimes to look compassionate before disappearing again. That was how the world worked. Nobody stayed. The judge entered moments later, calling the courtroom to order. Everyone rose. Eli stood slowly, his heartbeat thundering in his ears while the judge prepared to begin the hearing that could destroy the rest of his life. And somewhere behind him, sitting quietly in the shadows of the back row, Keanu Reeves continued watching with unusual focus, as though this frightened 17-year-old boy mattered far more than anyone else in the room. Realized. The prosecutor wasted no time. As soon as everyone settled into their seats, she rose confidently from her chair and approached the center of the courtroom with a thick folder tucked beneath her arm. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor, each step echoing through the silent room like a countdown. Your Honor, she began, this case is not simply about robbery. It is about escalating violence among young repeat offenders in our city. Eli felt the words strike him before she even looked his way. Repeat offender. Violence. Dangerous. The labels came so easily to people who had never once asked him who he really was. The prosecutor turned toward the jury box. The defendant, Eli Carter, was found at the scene of a brutal armed robbery that left local business owner Raj Patel hospitalized with severe injuries. Witness testimony places him near the attack moments before police arrived. A large screen flickered on beside the jury. Security footage appeared, grainy, blurry, dark, but clear enough to show Eli near the convenience store entrance that night. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Eli's throat tightened immediately. The video only lasted seconds, but to strangers, it looked convincing enough. A hooded teenager standing near shattered glass while chaos unfolded around him. Nobody watching would know what happened before or after that clip. Nobody would know Eli had run toward the violence instead of away from it. The prosecutor continued carefully building her version of him. School suspension records, fights, absences. One by one, mistakes from Eli's life were laid across the courtroom like pieces of evidence proving he had always been headed here. Eli stared at the defense table in silence while humiliation burned through him. He could feel reporters typing rapidly behind him, already shaping tomorrow's headlines. Troubled teen faces justice, violent youth finally cornered. His hands curled into fists beneath the table. Not from anger, from helplessness. Beside him, Martin leaned closer and whispered, "Stay calm." Easy for him to say. Nobody in this room looked at Eli like a human being anymore. He was becoming a symbol now. Another broken kid people could point toward whenever they wanted. Proof that the world was getting worse. The prosecutor finally called the first witness, a responding police officer. The officer described arriving at the scene, finding Eli nearby, and detaining him after witnesses shouted accusations through the crowd. "Did the defendant attempt to flee?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," the officer replied firmly. Eli's head snapped upward. "That's not true," he muttered instinctively. Martin immediately grabbed his arm. "Eli." But the damage was done. Several jurors glanced toward him with visible concern. The judge frowned sharply. "Mr. Carter," the judge warned, "you will remain silent unless instructed otherwise." Eli lowered his eyes again, shame crashing over him. He remembered that moment clearly now, the police screaming orders while people scattered everywhere in panic. He had stepped backward because someone shoved into him from behind. But explanations no longer mattered once fear entered a room. Fear always rewrote the story. Another witness claimed Eli had been seen arguing outside the store earlier that Achuid weak. Another described him as aggressive-looking. Aggressive-looking. Eli almost laughed bitterly hearing it. What did that even mean? Poor clothes? Dark circles under his eyes? The fact that he grew up in neighborhoods where surviving sometimes meant learning how not to look weak? Every answer painted him deeper into a corner he could no longer escape. Hours seemed to crawl by beneath the suffocating courtroom lights. Eli barely spoke, barely moved. Each time the prosecutor mentioned his name, it sounded less like she was describing a teenager and more like she was describing a future criminal. The city needed removed. And through all of it, Keanu Reeves remained silent in the back row, watching, listening, studying every detail carefully. At one point during a recess, reporters flooded into the hallway outside the courtroom, desperate for updates. Eli stayed seated while deputies guarded the doors nearby. He rubbed his exhausted eyes, feeling sleep deprivation and anxiety twisting together inside him. That was when he noticed movement. Keanu stood slowly from the back row. The courtroom quieted almost instantly. Even the reporters froze. Without speaking to anyone, Keanu walked calmly down the aisle toward the front of the courtroom. His expression remained thoughtful, serious, unreadable. Eli felt panic rise unexpectedly inside. His chest. Why was he coming over here? Martin noticed too, looking confused. Keanu stopped beside the defense table. Up close, he looked older and more tired than he did in movies. There was kindness in his face, but also something heavier, like he carried invisible grief most people never noticed. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Keanu pulled out the chair beside Eli and sat down quietly. The entire courtroom stared. Even the prosecutor paused mid-conversation across the room. Eli swallowed. Hard. Hi. Keanu gave a small nod. Hey, Eli. His voice was calm, gentle, not fake, not performative, just human. Eli didn't know what to say next. Why are you here? He finally asked quietly. Keanu looked toward the courtroom doors where reporters waited outside like vultures circling wounded prey. Then he looked back at Eli. Because sometimes, he said softly, people get judged long before anybody bothers learning the truth. The words hit Eli harder than he expected. Nobody had spoken to him like that since the arrest. Not the police, not the reporters, not even his own foster family. For weeks, every conversation around him had sounded like a verdict already decided. But somehow this stranger, this world-famous actor sitting beside him in a cold Chicago courtroom, looked at him differently. Like maybe he wasn't beyond saving yet. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Eli felt something dangerous returning to life inside him. Hope. The courthouse cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and wet coats. By late afternoon, the storm outside had grown worse, covering the courthouse windows with streaks of freezing rain that blurred the Chicago skyline into gray shadows. Most reporters remained gathered downstairs near the entrance, waiting for another dramatic update to feed the evening news cycle. Eli sat alone at a small metal table near the vending machines, turning an unopened carton of milk between his trembling hands. The courtroom had emptied temporarily for another recess, but the pressure still clung to him like chains wrapped around his chest. Every witness, every accusation, every stare from the jury replayed endlessly in his mind. He felt exhausted, not physically, deeper than that. The kind of exhaustion that came from fighting to prove you were human while the entire world insisted otherwise. Martin had disappeared upstairs to answer phone calls, leaving Eli alone with two deputies standing nearby. Neither officer spoke to him. They simply watched. Eli kept his head down. That was safer. Then a chair scraped softly across the floor. He looked up. Keanu Reeves sat across from him holding a paper cup of black coffee. He still wore the same dark jacket and baseball cap, though. Now a few strands of damp hair fell near his eyes from the snow outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable. Keanu glanced toward the untouched milk carton. "You should eat something." Eli shrugged faintly. "Not really hungry." That happens when fear takes over. The words were simple, but they landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Eli stared down at the table. "You talk like you know me." Keanu shook his head slowly. "No, I'm trying to." That answer caught Eli off guard. Most adults only talked at him. Teachers, social workers, police officers, foster parents. Everybody seemed more interested in correcting him than understanding him. But Keanu wasn't talking like that. He was listening. Outside the cafeteria doors, thunder rumbled faintly across the city. Keanu leaned back slightly. "I heard about your case from someone who volunteers at a youth shelter," he said quietly. Something about it didn't feel right. Eli frowned. "You came all the way here because of some random kid?" "You're not random," Eli almost laughed bitterly at that. "Yeah," he muttered. "Pretty sure everybody else disagrees." Keanu studied him carefully for a second before asking, "Did you try to help somebody that night?" The question hit Eli so suddenly his throat tightened, not because of the words themselves, because nobody had asked him that before. Not once. Police only asked where he was standing. Reporters only asked whether he belonged to a gang. The prosecutor only cared about proving motive. But this question was different. It saw something else. Eli stared down at his hands. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "The owner got hurt." Keanu stayed silent. "There were these guys inside the store," Eli continued slowly. "I knew one of them from around the neighborhood. I saw them pull masks on before they went in." His breathing became uneven as memories flooded back. "I heard yelling, then glass breaking." The cafeteria around them faded away. Suddenly, Eli was back there again. Cold air, sirens, blood on the sidewalk. "I ran inside because Mr. Patel was screaming," Eli whispered. "One of the guys hit him with something. I tried pulling him away, but then everybody started running when police came." His eyes filled despite his effort to stop it. "I didn't rob anybody." Keanu never interrupted him, never doubted him. And somehow that made Eli's voice shake even more. "The cops grabbed me before I could explain anything," Eli said. "People outside started pointing at me because I was covered in blood." He swallowed painfully. After that, nobody wanted to hear the rest. Silence settled between them again. Keanu slowly nodded once, as though confirming something inside his own mind. "I believe you," he said. Eli looked up immediately. The words felt almost unreal. "You don't even know me." A faint sadness crossed Keanu's face. "Sometimes you can tell when someone's carrying guilt," he replied quietly. And sometimes you can tell when they're carrying pain instead. Eli didn't know why those words affected him so much. Maybe because deep down he had stopped believing anyone would ever say them. Keanu took a careful sip of coffee before continuing. You know what fear does to people? Eli shrugged. It makes them simplify things, Keanu said. The world gets easier when people decide someone's the villain. Then they don't have to ask harder questions. Eli stared at him quietly. The actor's calmness felt strange compared to the chaos surrounding the trial. There was no performance in him. No celebrity arrogance, just patience, real patience. You ever get tired? Eli finally asked. Tired of what? People thinking they know who you are. Keanu smiled faintly at that, though sadness lingered behind it. All the time. For the first time all day, Eli almost smiled. Too. Almost. A deputy nearby checked his watch and announced the recess was ending soon. The small moment of peace immediately began slipping away. Eli's stomach tightened again as reality returned. Court, the jury, prison. Keanu noticed the fear creeping back into his expression. You know, he said softly, when I was younger, there were moments people expected me to fail too. Eli looked surprised. Seriously? Keanu nodded once. Life gets dark sometimes. Dark enough that people stop seeing you clearly. He paused briefly. But one thing I learned is this. A person shouldn't be defined by the worst moment surrounding them. The words settled deeply into Eli's chest. Nobody had ever spoken to him like he still had a future. Not in a long time. A deputy stepped forward. Court's resuming. Eli stood slowly from the table, anxiety immediately returning like a heavy weight around his neck. He looked toward the cafeteria doors leading back to the courtroom where strangers waited to decide whether his life still mattered. Then he glanced, back at Keanu. Why are you really helping me? Keanu rose quietly beside him. For a brief second, something deeply personal flickered behind his eyes. Because, he said softly, I know what it feels like when the world stops seeing the human being in front of them. And as they walked together toward the courtroom doors, Eli realized something that scared him almost as much as the trial itself. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel completely alone anymore. The courtroom felt colder when they returned. Outside, evening darkness had already swallowed the city, pressing against the courthouse windows while freezing. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Reporters filled nearly every back row seat now, their phones glowing faintly beneath dim courtroom lights. Word had spread across Chicago that Keanu Reeves was personally attending the trial of accused teenager Eli Carter. Nobody understood why, and that mystery only made the story bigger. As Eli walked back toward the defense table, he could feel cameras following him again. The whispers had changed now, less certainty, more curiosity. But curiosity could turn cruel just as quickly. The judge resumed proceedings with visible impatience. Everyone rose briefly before sitting again, and almost immediately the prosecutor stood to continue dismantling Eli's life piece by piece. We would now like to introduce additional behavioral records from Harrison South High School, she announced. Martin sighed quietly beside Eli. A clerk handed folders to the jury. Eli's chest tightened immediately. He already knew what was inside. Suspensions, fighting reports, anger evaluations written by counselors who barely spoke to him longer than 10 minutes. The prosecutor approached the jury slowly, carefully controlling every word. These records demonstrate a long pattern of aggression and instability. Aggression. Instability. The words echoed painfully inside Eli's head. A fight in 9th grade after another student mocked his mother's overdose. Another suspension after Eli punched a locker during a panic attack nobody recognized. Every ugly moment from his childhood now sat under bright courtroom lights, stripped of context until they looked like proof he had always been dangerous. The prosecutor lifted one document. School staff repeatedly described the defendant as emotionally volatile. Eli lowered his eyes. Across the room, several jurors studied the papers seriously. He wanted to scream. Not because the records were false, because they were incomplete. Nobody mentioned the nights he slept awake, listening to foster parents argue about sending him away. Nobody mentioned how often he skipped meals so younger foster kids could eat more. Nobody mentioned the afternoons he spent fixing broken bicycles for neighborhood children, because buying new ones was impossible for their families. Pain never looked noble on paperwork. Only ugly parts survived the system. The prosecutor called another witness, a former school security guard named Douglas Avery. The older man adjusted nervously before speaking. Eli got into fights pretty often, he said. Had trouble controlling his temper. Did he ever threaten students? The prosecutor asked. Douglas hesitated slightly. Not directly. But he created fear? I suppose sometimes? Yes. Eli clenched his jaw tightly. Fear. That word again. People kept describing what others felt around him without ever asking what he felt himself. Martin finally rose for cross-examination. Unlike the prosecutor's sharp confidence, Martin looked exhausted but determined. Mr. Avery, he began carefully, did Eli Carter also volunteer after school repairing damaged equipment in the community gym? The courtroom quieted slightly. Douglas blinked. Yes. Did he mentor younger students there? Yes. Did you ever personally witness him harming any child? No. Martin stepped closer. In fact, isn't it true Eli often broke up fights instead of starting them? The witness shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes, the prosecutor objected immediately, but for the first time all day, cracks began appearing in the narrative surrounding Eli. Tiny cracks. Still, they mattered. Eli glanced briefly toward the back row. Keanu sat silently watching every exchange with deep concentration. Not once had he checked his phone. Not once had he looked distracted. It was strange. Someone that famous could be anywhere in the world tonight. Movie premieres, luxury hotels, red carpets. Instead, he sat inside a freezing courtroom listening to strangers debate whether a frightened 17-year-old deserved to lose his future forever. The thought unsettled Eli emotionally more than he expected. The hearing dragged, late into the evening. Witness after witness blurred together until Eli's thoughts became heavy with exhaustion. At one point, he barely noticed the courtroom doors opening quietly. A tall man entered wearing a charcoal overcoat and approached the back row. He leaned down beside Keanu and whispered something into his ear. Keanu's expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, subtly, but Eli noticed. The actor nodded once before standing carefully and slipping out into the hallway with the man. Eli frowned slightly. Something about that exchange felt important. Minutes later, the judge called another recess. The second the gavel struck, reporters exploded into motion again, rushing toward the hallway searching for updates. Martin gathered paperwork quickly. "Stay here," he muttered to Eli before hurrying toward the clerk's desk. Eli remained seated alone. The courtroom slowly emptied until only deputies and a few exhausted journalists remained nearby. Then the side door opened quietly. Keanu stepped back inside. But this time something felt different about him, purposeful, focused. He walked directly toward Eli carrying a thin folder in his hand. Eli sat up slightly. "What happened?" Keanu glanced toward the nearly empty courtroom before lowering his voice. "My investigator found something." Eli's heartbeat quickened immediately. "What kind of something?" Keanu pulled out a photograph from the folder. and slid it carefully across the defense table. Eli stared at it, a grainy image from a nearby traffic camera, the convenience store visible in the background, and near the entrance. 3 figures running away, one carrying what looked like a metal object. Eli's breath caught instantly. "That's them," he whispered. Keanu nodded slowly. "The footage was never submitted." Eli looked up sharply. "Why?" "We don't know yet." The room suddenly felt too small, too hot. For weeks, Eli had been drowning beneath accusations while evidence like this existed somewhere unseen, buried, ignored, or hidden. His hands trembled holding the photograph. "You think this can help me?" Keanu studied him carefully before answering. "I think the truth matters," he said quietly. For several seconds, Eli couldn't speak. Hope was dangerous. After everything he'd lived through, hope felt almost more frightening than fear. Fear prepared you for disappointment. Hope made the fall hurt worse. But still, for the first time since the trial began, he could actually picture survival. Not prison walls, not headlines, survival. Outside the courtroom windows, snow continued falling across Chicago, covering streets in white silence while the city argued over whether Eli Carter deserved saving. Inside, sitting beneath dim fluorescent lights beside the one person still willing to believe in him, Eli stared at the hidden evidence in his shaking hands and felt the impossible beginning to happen. The story people thought they already understood was starting to unravel. By the next morning, the story had exploded across the country. Every television inside the courthouse lobby flashed the same images on repeat. Keanu Reeves entering the courtroom beside Eli Carter while reporters shouted questions from behind barricades. News anchors debated his involvement with expressions, ranging from admiration to disbelief. Why would Keanu Reeves involve himself in a violent robbery case? Does he know something the public doesn't? Or is Hollywood trying to rewrite the image of a dangerous teen? The headlines spread faster than truth ever could. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered despite the freezing weather. Some held signs supporting Eli after rumors about new evidence began circulating online. Others carried posters demanding harsher punishment for youth crime. Chicago had turned the trial into a spectacle. And at the center of it all sat a terrified, 17-year-old boy struggling to breathe beneath the weight of everyone's opinions. Eli entered through a side hallway escorted by deputies early that morning. The second he stepped inside, camera flashes exploded through nearby windows. He flinched instinctively. "You okay?" Martin asked quietly. Eli nodded, even though he wasn't. He barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined prison bars slamming shut while strangers cheered because justice had finally been served. Fear clung to him constantly now, like ice beneath his skin. As they approached the courtroom doors, shouting erupted outside. "Keanu, over here!" "Do you believe Eli Carter is innocent? Are you paying for his defense? Are you defending criminals now?" The noise echoed through the hallway. A moment later, Keanu appeared surrounded by reporters and courthouse security. He moved calmly through the chaos without reacting to the cameras shoved inches from his face. But Eli noticed something immediately. People looked at Keanu differently today, less admiration, more suspicion. One reporter called out loudly, "How can you support someone accused of almost killing a store owner?" The hallway suddenly went quiet. Keanu stopped walking. Security tried guiding him forward, but he turned slowly toward the crowd of reporters instead. For a second, nobody spoke. Snow-covered light poured through the courthouse windows behind him while cameras waited, desperately for a response. Keanu's voice remained calm when he finally answered. "Because accusations aren't the same as truth." Another reporter interrupted quickly. "But there's footage placing him at the scene." There's also evidence nobody bothered looking at closely enough. Murmurs spread immediately through the crowd. A third reporter stepped forward aggressively. Are you saying police mishandled the investigation? Keanu paused briefly. Then he said something that silenced the hallway completely. I think sometimes the world decides who a person is before learning who they had to become just to survive. No one moved after that. Even the reporters seemed caught off guard by the sadness in his voice. Eli stood frozen near the courtroom entrance, staring at him. Those words hit deeper than anything else people had said since the trial began. Because survival was exactly what his whole life had been. Surviving foster homes, surviving violence, surviving loneliness, surviving a world that expected him to fail before he even became old enough to vote. Keanu finally turned away from the cameras and walked toward the courtroom again. But the damage was already done. By lunchtime, clips of the interview flooded. Social media, some people praised him, others attacked him viciously. Talk shows accused him of glorifying criminals. Online commentators dug through Eli's past, searching for anything ugly enough to destroy public sympathy. Old cell phone videos from school fights resurfaced within hours. The city was turning against both of them now. Inside the courtroom, tension thickened with every passing minute. The prosecutor seemed sharper today, almost irritated by growing public attention around the case. She paced carefully before the jury while presenting more witness statements tying Eli to neighborhood gangs. He was frequently seen associating with known offenders, she argued. Eli wanted to protest again. Most of those kids weren't friends. They were simply people from the same streets. In neighborhoods like his, avoiding trouble sometimes meant standing beside it quietly and hoping it passed you by. But nuance didn't survive inside courtrooms. Everything became simplified. Good people, bad people, victims, threats. Martin attempted pushing back during cross-examination, but exhaustion showed on his face now. The trial was becoming larger than either of them expected. During another recess, Eli sat alone near the defense table while reporters flooded outside again. He stared blankly at the wooden floor. This is getting worse because of me, he muttered quietly. Keanu looked over from beside the jury rail. What is? You. Keanu frowned slightly. Eli shook his head. People are attacking you online now, saying crazy stuff. His voice tightened painfully. You shouldn't even be here. Keanu studied him silently for several seconds before walking over. Then he sat beside him again. You know something strange? He asked, softly. Eli glanced at him uncertainly. The people screaming the loudest usually know the least. A faint smile almost touched Eli's face before fading again. I'm serious, Keanu continued. Fear spreads fast, especially when people are told who deserves compassion and who doesn't. Eli looked away. Maybe they're right. Keanu's expression hardened slightly for the first time. No, he said quietly. Don't do that. Eli blinked. Don't let people convince you your life matters less because they only saw one chapter of it. The words settled heavily into the silence between them. Outside the courtroom windows, snow continued falling across Chicago while news helicopters circled overhead. The entire city seemed obsessed with deciding whether Eli Carter deserved redemption. But sitting there beside Keanu Reeves, listening to someone defend his humanity when the world seemed desperate to erase it, Eli felt something inside him beginning to crack open again. Not confidence, not peace, something smaller, something fragile. The possibility that maybe he wasn't born to become the monster everyone expected. That night, the storm finally broke. Rain hammered against the courthouse windows while thunder rolled across downtown Chicago like distant explosions. Most of the reporters had gone home hours earlier, but the building still carried the exhausted energy of too many people fighting over one boy's future. The judge had extended proceedings late into the evening after unexpected witness delays, leaving everyone drained and irritable. Court staff moved through the hallways with tired expressions, while deputies whispered near vending machines, counting the minutes until they could leave. Eli sat alone inside a holding room beneath the courthouse. The small concrete room smelled faintly of bleach and rust. A buzzing fluorescent light flickered overhead, making shadows twitch across the walls every few seconds. Somewhere down the corridor, metal doors slammed shut one after another. He stared at the floor in silence. Hours earlier, Martin had delivered devastating news. The witness Keanu's investigator located, the man who supposedly saw the real, attackers fleeing the scene, had disappeared. No calls, no answers, gone. And without testimony connecting the new footage to the robbery, the prosecution was already moving to challenge its credibility. Everything that had briefly felt hopeful was collapsing again. Eli leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on his knees while panic twisted violently inside his chest. He felt trapped between two versions of his future: prison walls or endless suspicion. Even if the jury doubted the charges now, would anybody ever fully believe him again? Probably not. Once the world branded you dangerous, the stain never completely disappeared. A sharp breath escaped him as emotion finally overwhelmed the numbness he had carried for weeks. He buried his face in his hands. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered shakily to nobody. The words echoed softly around the empty room. For several seconds, only rain answered him. Then the metal door opened quietly. Keanu Reeves stepped inside. No cameras followed him here, no reporters, no audience, just silence. A deputy closed the door behind him, leaving the two of them, alone beneath the flickering fluorescent light. Keanu looked at Eli carefully before sitting beside him on the narrow bench against the wall. Neither spoke at first. Eli wiped quickly at his face, embarrassed to be seen crying. "Sorry." Keanu shook his head gently. "You don't have to apologize for being overwhelmed." Eli laughed bitterly under his breath. "Everybody keeps saying stay calm," he muttered. "Stay quiet, stay respectful." His voice cracked suddenly. "I'm trying, man, I really am." Keanu remained silent, letting him speak. "But it feels like none of it matters." Eli's breathing became uneven again. "Even when evidence shows up, people still look at me like I'm guilty." He stared at the floor helplessly. It's like once they decided who I was, that was it. The room grew painfully quiet. Rainwater streaked slowly down the tiny reinforced window, high in the wall. Eli swallowed hard before speaking again, softer this time. "You know what scares me the most?" Keanu looked toward him. That maybe they're right. The confession hung heavily in the air. Eli clenched his shaking hands together. "Maybe I really am messed up." Tears filled his eyes again, despite his effort to stop them. "I mean, look at my life. Every foster home, every fight, every screw-up." He laughed weakly through the emotion. "Maybe this was always where I was gonna end up." For the first time since entering the room, Keanu spoke. "No." Just one word. Quiet. Certain. Eli stared at him. Keanu leaned back against the wall. Slowly, his expression distant for a moment, as if remembering something painful. "When I was younger," he said softly, "there were periods where grief followed me everywhere." Eli stayed silent. Keanu rarely spoke publicly about personal pain, but something about his voice now carried the weight of old scars. "I lost people I loved," he continued. "And after enough loss, something changes inside you." He paused briefly. "You start expecting life to hurt. You start believing happiness belongs to other people." The flickering light buzzed overhead again. "There were moments I felt completely disconnected from everyone around me," Keanu admitted quietly. moments where I wondered if anybody really saw me anymore beyond whatever image they created in their heads. Eli listened carefully, not because Keanu was famous, because he sounded honest, painfully honest. Keanu looked directly at him, now. But here's what I learned. His voice remained calm. People survive dark places because eventually, someone reminds them they're still worth something. Eli's eyes lowered again. No teacher had ever told him that. No foster parent, no police officer. Worth something. The words felt foreign. Keanu continued softly. You've spent your whole life surviving environments that taught you to expect abandonment. He glanced toward the steel door. So now when people attack you, part of you believes you deserve it. Eli felt tears sliding down his face again before he could stop them. Because it was true. Every cruel headline, every suspicious stare, every accusation. A part of him accepted them automatically, like punishment he'd been preparing for his entire life. I'm scared, Eli admitted finally. Keanu nodded slowly. I know. They're gonna lock me away. I don't know what the verdict will be yet, Keanu said honestly. But I do know this trial doesn't decide your value as a human being. Eli covered his mouth briefly, trying to steady his breathing. For the first time in years, he was crying in front of someone without feeling weak for it. And somehow that made the emotions hit even harder. Keanu sat quietly beside him through the silence that followed. No speeches, no fake inspiration. Just presence. The kind Eli realized he'd been missing most of his life. Eventually, Keanu spoke again, his voice almost barely above the sound of rain. You don't become who the world expects overnight, he said. And you don't heal overnight either. He looked toward Eli carefully. But you're still here. That matters. Eli stared at the concrete floor for a long moment. Then slowly, painfully, he nodded. Outside, thunder rolled across Chicago, while rain washed the city streets clean beneath the darkness. And inside that small holding room beneath the courthouse, a frightened 17-year-old boy who had spent his entire life believing he was disposable finally heard something powerful. Enough to break through years of pain. Not that he was innocent. Not that everything would magically be okay. Something deeper. That maybe, just maybe, he was still worth saving. The final day of the trial arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Snow covered the streets of downtown Chicago, overnight turning sidewalks white and silent before sunrise. News vans already lined the courthouse steps by 6 a.m, their satellite dishes pointed toward the clouds while reporters rehearsed dramatic introductions for live broadcasts. The entire city seemed to be watching now. Some believed Eli Carter was an innocent teenager crushed beneath a broken system. Others still saw him as a violent kid hiding behind celebrity sympathy. But by the time court began that morning, one thing had become clear to everyone. Whatever happened inside courtroom 18B would follow Eli for the rest of his life. The courthouse overflowed with tension. Reporters crowded every available bench. Spectators whispered nervously while deputies struggled to maintain order near the doors. Even the jury looked emotionally exhausted after days of testimony, evidence, and endless public pressure. Eli sat silently beside Martin, wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt he had worn throughout the trial. His eyes looked hollow from lack of sleep. Across the room, the prosecutor organized her final notes with calm confidence. She believed she still had the case, and honestly, Eli feared she might be right. The missing witness had never reappeared. The newly discovered footage remained challenged and incomplete, without direct testimony proving. Eli tried helping the store owner. The prosecution continued arguing he was simply another participant attempting to save himself after things went wrong. Fear sat heavily inside Eli's chest as proceedings began. He barely noticed when Keanu, Reeves entered the courtroom quietly and took his usual seat in the back row. But today Keanu looked different, focused, restless, like he was waiting for something. The judge called the courtroom to order. Then the prosecutor stood for closing arguments. She walked slowly before the jury, her voice sharp and controlled. "This case is ultimately about accountability," she began. "The defense would like you to believe the defendant is merely misunderstood. But evidence consistently places Elijah Carter at the scene of a violent robbery." She paused near the jury box. "A man nearly lost his life that night." Eli lowered his eyes. The prosecutor continued carefully dismantling every remaining doubt. She pointed toward Eli's school records, his prior fights, his proximity to known offenders. Again and again, she painted him as a product of violence destined to continue it. "Sympathy," she said firmly, "cannot replace facts." Several jurors nodded faintly. Eli's stomach twisted painfully. This was it. The final day of the trial arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Snow covered the streets of downtown Chicago overnight, turning sidewalks white and silent before sunrise. News vans already lined the courthouse steps by 6 a.m, their satellite dishes pointed toward the clouds while reporters rehearsed dramatic introductions for live broadcasts. The entire city seemed to be watching now. Some believed Eli Carter was an innocent teenager crushed beneath a broken system. Others still saw him as a violent kid hiding behind celebrity sympathy. But by the time court began that morning, one thing had become clear to everyone. Whatever happened inside courtroom 18B would follow Eli for the rest of his life. The courthouse overflowed with tension. Reporters crowded every available bench. Spectators whispered nervously while deputies struggled to maintain order near the doors. Even the jury looked emotionally exhausted after days of testimony, evidence, and endless public pressure. Eli sat silently beside Martin, wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt he had worn throughout the trial. His eyes looked hollow from lack of sleep. Across the room, the prosecutor organized her final notes with calm confidence. She believed she still had the case, and honestly, Eli feared she might be right. The missing witness had never reappeared. The newly discovered footage remained challenged and incomplete. Without direct testimony proving Eli tried helping the store owner, the prosecution continued arguing he was simply another participant attempting to save himself after things went wrong. Fear sat heavily inside Eli's chest as proceedings began. He barely noticed when Keanu Reeves entered the courtroom quietly and took his usual seat in the back row. But today, Keanu looked different. Focused, restless, like he was waiting for something. The judge called the courtroom to order. Then the prosecutor stood for closing arguments. She walked slowly before the jury, her voice sharp and controlled. "This case is ultimately about accountability," she began. "The defense would like you to believe the defendant is merely misunderstood. But evidence consistently places Elijah Carter at the scene of a violent robbery." She paused near the jury box. "A man nearly lost his life that night." Eli lowered his eyes. The prosecutor continued carefully dismantling every remaining doubt. She pointed toward Eli's school records, his prior fights, his proximity to known offenders. Again and again, she painted him as a product of violence destined to continue it. "Sympathy," she said firmly, "cannot replace facts." Several jurors nodded faintly. Eli's stomach twisted painfully. This was it. The moment deciding everything. When the prosecutor finally returned to her seat, silence settled across the courtroom. Martin stood slowly afterward. Unlike the prosecution's polished confidence, he looked emotionally worn down. But something in his expression carried quiet determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began carefully, "the easiest thing in this world is deciding who someone is before hearing their full story." He gestured softly toward Eli. Yes, Elijah Carter has made mistakes. Yes, he comes from hardship. But hardship is not proof of guilt. Martin's voice strengthened slightly. The prosecution built this case around assumptions, around fear, around the image of a troubled teenager standing near a terrible crime. He paused. But standing near tragedy does not make someone responsible for it. For the first time all morning, Eli looked up. Martin continued speaking passionately about incomplete investigations, rushed conclusions, and the danger of turning broken childhoods into evidence of criminal destiny. But even as he spoke, Eli sensed uncertainty in the room. The jury still looked conflicted. Fear still lingered, and fear often won. Martin eventually returned quietly to his seat. The judge prepared instructions for jury deliberation. Everything felt suddenly final. Eli's pulse hammered violently inside his chest. He looked toward the gallery one last time and noticed Keanu staring toward the courtroom doors instead of the judge. Then, the doors burst open. Every head turned instantly. Man in a dark overcoat rushed inside carrying a small black case clutched tightly against his chest. Keanu stood immediately. Eli recognized the man at once. The investigator. Breathing heavily, the investigator hurried toward Martin and whispered urgently into his ear. Martin's eyes widened. What? The prosecutor snapped sharply from across the room. The investigator opened the black case and pulled out a portable hard drive. "We found additional footage," he said breathlessly. The courtroom exploded into murmurs. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order?" Martin was already moving quickly toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said urgently, "the defense has just received newly recovered surveillance footage from a city transit bus operating near the crime scene." The courtroom did not move, not at first. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Even the air felt suspended in place after Raj Patel's words echoed off the wooden walls. The injured shop owner stood near the front, trembling. Slightly, one hand gripping his cane while the other pointed toward Eli Carter like a final declaration that could not be undone. "That boy tried to save me." Those words didn't just challenge the prosecution, they collapsed it. The prosecutor stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as if she had prepared 1,000 arguments, but none of them worked in this moment. The jury looked stunned, exchanging uncertain glances that now carried doubt instead of certainty. And Eli. Eli sat completely still. His hands were shaking violently under the table, but he didn't even try to hide it anymore. Tears blurred his vision as he stared at Mr. Patel, trying to understand if this was real or another cruel twist his mind had created out of desperation. Behind him, the faint sound of camera shutters filled the silence. Reporters were no longer whispering. They were witnessing. Keanu Reeves remained standing near the back row, his expression unchanged, but his eyes carried something deeper now, quiet relief mixed with a sadness that suggested he understood exactly what this moment meant for Eli. The judge cleared his throat, visibly shaken. "Order. Everyone, please remain seated." But nobody really listened. The truth had already entered the room, and it refused to leave. Martin slowly stood, his voice calmer now, stronger than it had been the entire trial. "Your Honor, I request that the court formally admit the recovered footage and the victim's statement as direct evidence of innocence." The prosecutor attempted to speak, but her words came out fractured. This changes context, not intent." "No," Martin interrupted firmly, for the first time cutting through her confidence. "It changes everything." A long silence followed. The judge looked at the screen again, then at Raj Patel, then finally at Eli. The weight of the decision no longer felt complicated. It felt obvious. "Given the new evidence," the judge said slowly, "and the testimony of the victim, this court will dismiss all charges against the defendant." For a moment, the words didn't register in Eli's mind. Dismissed. Charges dismissed. He blinked once, twice. And then reality finally broke through. His breath left his body in a sharp, uneven exhale as his head dropped forward into his hands. The sound that escaped him wasn't a cry at first. It was disbelief trying to turn into relief and failing halfway. Around him, the courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted. Jurors whispered in shock. Martin covered his mouth, overwhelmed. But Eli didn't hear any of it clearly, because inside his chest, something heavy, something he had carried for months, finally cracked open and fell away. He was free, not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally, actually free. Slowly, Eli looked up again, tears still falling, and saw Raj Patel walking carefully toward him. The old man stopped beside the defense table and placed a trembling hand on Eli's shoulder. "I'm sorry," Raj said softly. "I'm sorry they made you carry this alone." Eli shook his head, unable to speak. He wanted to say so many things, that he tried to help, that he never wanted anyone hurt, that nobody had believed him until it was almost too late. But nothing came out except a broken whisper. "I thought no one would ever believe me." Raj squeezed his shoulder gently. "I do now." Behind them, the prosecutor sat down slowly, defeated in a way that had nothing to do with losing a case and everything to do with realizing how easily a life could have been destroyed on incomplete truth. The judge adjourned court quietly, but nobody left immediately, because something bigger than the trial was happening in that room. People were no longer watching a case. They were watching a boy being returned to his life. Eli stood slowly from his seat, legs unsteady, and for the first time in months, no one stopped him. No one grabbed his arm. No one labeled him. No one judged him mid-step. He just walked. Out from behind the defense table, through the center aisle, toward the courtroom doors that had once felt like an ending. As he reached them, he hesitated. The noise behind him faded slightly. He turned his head. Keanu stood near the back, still watching him quietly. No speech, no dramatic gesture, just presence, steady and real. For a moment, Eli didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, a small, broken, grateful nod. Keanu returned it. That was all. Eli pushed the doors open. Cold Chicago air rushed into his face immediately, sharp and alive. Outside, the city was still gray, still messy, still real. But for the first time, it didn't feel like it was closing in on him. Reporters flooded the steps instantly, shouting questions, but Eli didn't answer any of them. He kept walking down the courthouse stairs slowly, overwhelmed by the feeling of not being chased anymore. Behind him, inside the building, life continued. But his had already shifted. Days later, the truth would spread across news channels, correcting headlines that had once condemned him. Apologies would be issued. Opinions would shift. People would debate what they should have seen earlier. But none of that mattered as much as what happened in the quiet moment Eli finally stepped away from the courthouse. Because for the first time since everything began, he was no longer the boy everyone already judged. He was just Eli again. And somewhere behind him, in the distance of a world that had nearly broken him, a stranger who chose to believe before proof existed had changed the course of his life forever.